Hello, thank you for joining us for this virtual trip to Mallorca. So, why Mallorca? It's an extremely popular destination and many of you will have visited. It's a stunningly beautiful island and it caters for all ages, all budgets and almost all interests with the possible exception of skiing. Now, the earliest promotional material can be found from the 1920s and 30s, and that includes the phrase, the island of calm. Now, in the 50s and 60s, cinema played a role in encouraging mass tourism, and Sean Connery, Michael Caine, Joan Collins, they all shot films here. And the images of busy beaches and the white bodies of sunbathing tourists supplanted the earlier images of landscape and culture, which were used in the 20s and 30s. Now, interestingly, more recently, there's been a return to the images promoted in the 1920s. The stunning villas and scenery featured in The Night Manager or in Love Island are good examples. However, you still may be unaware that the island has a university, a strong tradition of preserving cultural heritage, a thriving artistic scene, an agricultural community, and famous shoemakers. The Camper shoe brand is Mallorcan. And a lot of Mallorca is hidden from view, particularly to tourists. And I would like to include information about that today. Okay, so who am I? My name is Richard Thompson. I'm British and I've been living in Mallorca for the last 6 years and I run a fieldwork centre here on the island. Before that, I lived in Catalonia and I was previously manager of a field study centre in Barcelona. And I've been in Spain for nearly 20 years now. Okay, so a few facts and figures before we start looking at some pictures of some photos of Mallorca. Spain is divided into 17 regions, one being the Balearic Islands in the Western Mediterranean. And I've put a yellow rectangle around the island of Mallorca, the largest island of the Balearics. Now, over the past 3,000 years, Mallorca has been under the rule of the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Vandals, the Romans, and the Moors. Now, in 2019, that was the last year, the population was just over 896,000. Now, the economy of all the Balearic Islands is heavily reliant on tourism. About nearly 35% of the Balearic Islands GDP is from tourism. And with regards to Mallorca, in 2019, 11.9 million tourists visited the island. Now, obviously, the 2020 figures will be extremely different, and tourism in the future will all depend on the evolution of the current global pandemic. Now, we're going to be following this particular route. Now, if later on, if you go to the Discover the World Education website, they've got a great GIS graphic. And I've taken a screen grab of that here. And we're going to use that as a route map as we learn about the hidden side of Mallorca. One thing perhaps to note as you're looking at that satellite image is that Mallorca, if you've got a creative imagination, looks like the head of a goat. Right, let's start with the Tramontana Mountains. Now they stretch for about 85 kilometers from the southwest to the northeast of the island. And if you look at the bottom right photo, you can see the mountains there. Now, they were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in June 2011. And the description on the UNESCO website is as follows. The cultural landscape of the Serra de Tramontana, located on a sheer-sided mountain range parallel to the northwestern coast of the island of Mallorca. Millennia of agriculture in an environment with scarce resources has transformed the terrain and displays an articulated network of devices for the management of water revolving around farming units of feudal origins. The landscape is marked by agricultural terraces and interconnected waterworks, including watermills, as well as dry stone constructions and farms. Now, in the bottom left picture, you can see some of the terracing there. Some of you may be aware that if you don't cut terraces into sort of a steep hillside, any farming that takes place will be unsuccessful because the topsoil gets washed away very, very quickly. So in Spain, this is very, very common to see these terraces for farming purposes. Now, a lot of sports tourists come to the Tramontana mountain range for hiking, climbing, caving, and biking. Other tourists come to admire the limestone karst scenery and to visit the picturesque villages. Now, for a Mediterranean island, the issue of fresh water is of fundamental importance, and huge numbers of tourists put natural resources under strain. Now, that's why in 1972, 2 reservoirs were constructed in the central part of the mountain range, and you can see one of them top left. However, they only provide 2.6% of the island's fresh water. Mallorca is becoming more and more reliant on desalination plants, and government drought alerts are becoming more and more common. And I can vouch for that. I've been living here for 6 years, and every summer the water supply in our village gets cut off on at least 3 or 4 occasions. VALLDEMOSSA. Now, this is a really picturesque village, as you can see from the top photo, located in the Tramontana Mountains. And it's only a 25-minute coast journey from Palma, so it's ideal for a day trip for tourists. Now, since the 19th century, VALLDEMOSSA has been promoted internationally as a place of outstanding beauty, largely as a result of the affection of a distinguished traveller and cultural writer, the Austrian Archduke Ludwig Salvator. Now, as well as being incredibly beautiful, it's the location of a 13th century royal palace, which you can see bottom right, which was later converted into a monastery. And that's where the Polish composer Frédéric Chopin spent a winter, 1838 to 39, with his partner, the French writer George Sand. And she wrote a very famous book called A Winter in Mallorca, describing their visit and praising the island's natural beauty, but criticising what she perceived as the prejudice and vices of the natives. Perhaps it says more about her than the Mallorcans. It's also the birthplace of Mallorca's patron saint, Catalina Tomàs. So you get a lot of people visiting the VALLDEMOSSA to see her birthplace as well. Now, there are ample parking spaces for coaches, cars, and a lot of shops for tourists. It's a classic tourist honeypot site, but the concern is that it's being saturated. It's the village with the highest tourist pressure index in Spain. Now, the village has just under 2,000 inhabitants, but last August it received over 5,500 daily visitors. Huge number of visitors. Okay, let's move on to another town in the Tramontana mountain range, which is Sóller. Now, we've got a picture of the train which travels from Palma to Sóller, and then the second photo is of the port of Sóller, which is about 5 kilometers from the town of Sóller. Now, the isolated geographical location of soya is key to understanding its evolution. Thanks to soya's natural port and the trading of citrus fruit, from the 18th century, the town established more of a connection with southern France than with the rest of the island. The architecture, the language, and the traditions here all have French influences. Now, the train tunnel through the mountain range was constructed in 1912, which allowed access to Palma and other parts of the island. And this train line is now a major tourist attraction, and I would say that it's reasonably sustainable, as the number of passengers on the train is limited by the number of seats. And on the train journey, which I highly recommend, you see the stunning limestone scenery of the Tramontana Mountains. And once you arrive in Soya, you then transfer to an old tram, and that takes you the 5 kilometers to the port of Soya, and you can stop off and enjoy the natural harbour there. And you can also possibly decide to go on a boat trip from the port to Soya. Now, the 1-hour trip from the port travels east, and you will arrive to the beautiful little coastal village of CALOBRA. And that's the boat trip is a very popular activity for tourists. It began in the 1960s when tourists started asking local fishermen if they could take them on trips. One of them converted his traditional fishing vessel called a yacht by installing seats and cushions. And today there are purpose-built sightseeing boats, and you can see 3 different types in the photos here. Now, in terms of physical geography, the coastal formations are of interest, stacks, stumps, arches, caves, etc. And with regards to human geography, you often see sports climbers on these sea cliffs. Now, climbing on sea cliffs without ropes is called deep water soloing, or here in Mallorca it's called psychoblock. And this sport originated here in the 1980s. And the sport became really famous from 2003 onwards, thanks to a series of films that were shot here, featuring the American climber Chris Sharma. Now, after an hour, you reach the very picturesque village of CALOBRA, which is adjacent to a gorge, but more of that in a second. Now, the port, CALOBRA can be reached via the boat trip, or via a 14-kilometer road with 200 curves that descends 900 meters. So there's 2 ways to get there. And that road is a favorite with cyclists. Now, since 2017, a maximum of 35 tourist coaches can drive down in the morning. And to avoid traffic jams, they can only drive back up in the afternoon. CALOBRA is at the mouth of the Torrent de Pareix, a spectacular 3-kilometer long gorge with incredibly high sides. At the highest point, they are 300 meters in height. And you do need some experience if you wish to enter the gorge. Gorge walking or canyoning is a very popular activity, but you really do need a guide if you wish to do that activity, and the guide will be well equipped with ropes, and you'll wear helmets, and as you can see from the photo bottom right, you need to wear wetsuits as well. It is potentially dangerous, particularly in the rainy season, so please be careful. Now, the Esplar Education Centre. This is my education centre, which I founded along with my wife 6 years ago. And basically, we specialise in geography fieldwork case studies. They include rural and urban regeneration, water security, coastal management, and processes, sustainability, and tourism. And we work with a variety of freelance teachers and activity specialists. Now, Espla is the central region of Mallorca, and it means the plain. And there are many windmills in this area, hence our logo, which you can see bottom left. And the photo is a group of geography students conducting some field work in our village. Let's move on to San Juan. Now, this is where I and my family live. You can see the little sign there, top left, San Juan, 0.2 kilometers. I don't know quite why they bothered, but I do really like that sign. Now, the village is just over 2,000 people live here, and it's in the very center of the island. Many of the traditional houses here have internal wells called cisternas, which are used to store rainwater collected from the roofs. And they're still actively used. As I mentioned earlier, the mains water supply is not guaranteed in the summer months due to overuse and to droughts as well. Now, up until the 1980s, almost everybody in the village was involved with agriculture. Now, most people who live here commute to the island's major towns to work. Now, the major towns being Palma, the city of Palma, and then the towns of Manacor, Inca, and Alcudia. Now, tourism has led to a substantial increase in the cost of housing in Palma. And this in turn has resulted in urban to rural migration. The saturation of the coastal resorts has also led to changes in our village. Up until about 5 years ago, there was almost no tourism here whatsoever. Now, there are rural hotels owned by large hotel groups, as well as many private houses for rent. And the village is now debating its identity. Are we a commuter village, a rural tourism destination, or an undiscovered cultural reserve? The jury is still out. We're trying to decide. Now, 5 kilometers to the north of San Juan is the village of SINEU. This is the most important village in the Espla region. Now, for the past 700 years, it has held a weekly market. And over the past 20 years or so, this has become a major tourist attraction, with up to 6,000 people visiting every Wednesday. Many of the tour operators include it in their itineraries, and its main challenge in the face of overcrowding is to continue to maintain the market's identity and to promote responsible tourism. Now, many people in the village like the market because it's just one day a week. So they have one day when there are hordes of people who descend on the village, and the other 6 days of the week, the village is relatively quiet. One other thing to mention is the development of the village was also helped by the re-establishment of the railway line in 2003. And SINEU is where we conduct rural regeneration and rural rebranding studies. You can see in the photos, traditional fruit and vegetables, top left, traditional fabrics from Mallorca. Then on the right, you've got traditional bottles of oil and of spirits. And then bottom left, you can see that some of the people in the market have emphasizing the fact they speak 4 different languages. They're English, German, Spanish, and French. Okay, the next slide looks at the S'Albufera Natural Park. Now, it's the largest and most important wetland area in Mallorca and located near Alcudia in the northeast of the island. Over the past 300 years, human activity has halved the size of these wetlands. However, in February 1988, it was declared a natural park thus providing some degree of environmental protection. And now in 2020, more than 250 types of birds can be found there, and it's a major tourist attraction. Now, if you look at the photo top left, and in the top right of that photo, you can make out a building, and that is a power station. And up until last year, that power station used coal to power its turbines. So not a great location for a coal-fired power station next to a natural park. Fortunately, now only natural gas is used. Now, over the road from the entrance to the park is a protected area of sand dunes, and wooden walkways have been constructed to allow tourists to reach the beaches without damaging this natural ecosystem. And you can see an example of one of the walkways in the photo, bottom left, and you can see this was a photo taken early in the morning of the sun loungers and the parasols ready for the tourists. Okay, Levant Natural Park. This is another natural park in the eastern part of the island, and this was established in 1999. The landscape comprises of high mountains, cliffs, and natural beaches, and there are plans to enlarge it. Various species, such as the kites, the black vulture, and the Mediterranean tortoise, have been reintroduced to this area, and hiking and mountain biking are very popular activities in the park. Now, next we're going to have a look at 3 coastal villages. Now we have here, and look at Cala BONA, Cala MILLOR, and Cala RATJADA. Now, prior to the advent of mass tourism in Mallorca in the 1960s, coastal processes and systems were largely unaffected by human interference. For example, coasts were afforded natural protection by dead seagrass leaves. And you can see those in the photo bottom left. And the Latin name is Posidonia oceanica for the type of seagrass. And the seagrass meadows are located on the seabeds in the seas off Mallorca. Now, the dead seagrass leaves were washed ashore, and these acted as a natural cushion that absorbed wave energy. And in that photo there, it's incredible. You can see, I mean, that was taken on a day in the summer where there were not very many waves, but I've seen in the autumn big waves hitting these Posidonia mattresses, if you like, and it's incredible how they can absorb the energy of really, really big waves. Now, the coastal resorts of Cala BONA and Cala MILLOR rely on package tourism, and the central photo is of Cala MILLOR. And every year, many of the beaches are cleared of the seagrass to provide beaches that the hoteliers view as attractive to tourists, i.e. without seagrass. Because the hoteliers view the seagrass as being unsightly, it perhaps smells a little bit, and perhaps is a little bit uncomfortable underfoot. And in the middle of that photo there, you can see a big pile of seagrass that has been removed by bulldozers. Now, coastal management techniques, modern coastal management techniques, have involved the construction of a variety of different sea defences, including sea walls, you can see that in that photo, breakwaters, riprap, and groins. However, their efficacy was brought into question in January of this year by Storm Gloria. Now, if you look at the photo far right, and that is from another little coastal village called Cala RATJADA, huge amounts of damage were caused. Now, the Spanish government has offered 4.4 million euros to repair the damage, but the hoteliers are estimating that 10 million euros will be needed. And there's now a debate going on which centres on reconstruction versus deconstruction. Is it worth investing huge amounts of money to reconstruct these coastal promenades if in a year's time we get more storms and they're going to be destroyed again? So is it perhaps a better idea to return to nature and perhaps rely on the seagrass mattresses to provide the protection? As I said, it's a debate that is going on at the moment. The DRACH caves. Now, these were named as a natural wonder by National Geographic magazine in 2018, and they comprise of 4 connected limestone caves. They're 25 meters underground and stretch for 2.4 kilometers and include one of the largest subterranean lakes in the world. Lake Martel is named after the French caver who discovered it in 1896. They're located near to Porto Cristo on the east coast of the island, and coaches arrive from hotels around the island, and every year they're visited by around 600,000 people. First written reference to the caves is from the 14th century. Now, south of Porto Cristo, you have PORTOCOLOM, which you can see bottom left, the photo of this natural harbour. It's incredibly picturesque. And bottom right, you can see some pictures of the typical boats in Mallorca, which are called yachts. Now, although flash flooding is a common natural hazard in Mallorca, very severe flash floods are much less common. However, on the 6th of September 1989, Mallorca's east coast experienced what was then considered the worst flooding since 1932. Now, in the half century between these two events, the economy of the island had changed from being agrarian to one focused on tourism. And the potential risks and impact of flash flooding had unfortunately been forgotten. Added to this, the tourist industry from the 1960s on had been promoting the island as having guaranteed summer sunshine. And this perhaps explains why in the 1980s there was such a lack of awareness and subsequent complacency about this natural hazard. In PORTOCOLOM, the decision in 1988 to open a hotel that had been built in a dry riverbed proved fatal. And if you look top right, you can see this hotel, about 6-story hotel, which was built in the middle of a dry riverbed. And what happened was a flash flood inundated the hotel, and 3 hotel employees were trapped in the basement and drowned. Now, since 1989, different techniques have been employed in PORTOCOLOM to minimize the impact of future flash floods. There's a subterranean tunnel, for example. Tragically, another flash flood occurred about a year and a half ago, on the 9th of October 2018, in another Mallorcan village called Sant Llorenç, which is about 20 minutes of where I live. And in that flash flood, 13 people lost their lives. So it is a major issue in Mallorca. Palma, as you will know, is the capital city of the Balearic Islands in Spain. And it's located on the south coast of Mallorca, on the Bay of Palma. Current population is about 416,000, which is just under half the population of Mallorca. Now, 5 years ago, the Sunday Times selected Palma as the best place in the world in which to live. And I quote, they said, it has everything and everything is easily accessible. It's just 10 minutes from the airport, and there are, or were, plenty of cheap regular flights to almost all European countries. However, over the past 2 decades, too many residential buildings were converted into luxury hotels, tourist apartments, second homes, or nightlife venues. And this resulted in the loss of the sense of community in many of the neighbourhoods, which was what had made them desirable places in which to live or visit in the first place. And you can see this, I took this photo a couple of years ago. And if I can translate that, it says the city is for those who live there, not for those who are visiting. And there's a picture of a lady who's waving her walking stick at tourists, and she has a little shopping trolley, and the tourists have their suitcase on wheels, and they have with their selfie sticks. I thought it was a very, very creative image. And there's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a certain section of the island who are not in favour of tourism. It's a real problem here. You've got some people who rely on tourism for their income, and other people who think there's way too much. Now, another thing that happened due to the gentrification of many neighbourhoods in Palma was the fact that the rents soared, and many local people couldn't afford to live there. And the city centre was also becoming overcrowded with tourists. So as a result of this, in April 2018, the city council banned homeowners in Palma from renting out their apartments to tourists. They were the first city in Spain to do that. And they gave huge, they've been giving huge fines to the Airbnb company, who've continued to offer places in Palma. But if you're caught renting out your apartment to tourists, you receive a massive fine. Now, another thing I should mention about Palma is that it's a very, very popular venue for cruise ships, and Palma is normally visited by around 500 of them per year, and carrying approximately 2 million passengers. And in the summer, there are often 5 and even as many as 8 moored in the port. Now, if you can imagine each one with up to 5,000 passengers aboard, and they spend perhaps a day, 24 hours in Palma, and suddenly you're getting huge numbers of tourists coming in to explore the city, which can cause a lot of congestion in popular areas. On the other hand, the tourists from the cruise ships bring in about 256 million euros to the island, and 5,000 jobs are supported. So again, it's a massive conflict. And the last thing to mention, you can see bottom left, a photo of some recycling containers which are driven to different parts of the city. The old city, the very, very narrow streets. So this is the system they use. They've got a little sort of tractor unit which takes these portable recycling bins and drops them off at different places around the city. BELLVER Castle is a Gothic style castle on a hill about 3 kilometers to the west of Palma, as you can see in the photo bottom left. It was built in the 14th century for King James II of Mallorca, and is one of the few circular castles in Europe. Originally, it was the residence for the kings of Mallorca, and then from the 18th to the mid-20th century, it was used as a military prison. It's now under civilian control and is one of the main tourist attractions on the island. And it's also home to the city's history museum, well worth a visit. Palma Cathedral is a Gothic Roman Catholic cathedral that was constructed on the site of a Moorish-era mosque. Now, the work began in 1229 and finished in 1601. And in the early part of the 20th century, the Catalan architect Antoni Gaudi was involved in a restoration project, and he experimented with techniques that he would later use when constructing the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Now, the cathedral here is one of the few cathedrals in the world that was built next to the sea. Now there's a man-made lake on reclaimed land, which you can see bottom left. But prior to the construction of that lake in the early 1970s, the seas reached the walls of the cathedral, and it receives around 600,000 visitors every year. And the top left, you can see there a picture of cruise ships in the port of Palma. And as I mentioned earlier, they're there often for about 24 hours, and huge numbers of passengers will disembark and head to the cathedral. So it's extreme in the summer months, in particular in July and August. It's extremely difficult to walk around the neighborhood around the cathedral because there's so many tourists there. Palma Aquarium is a commercial aquarium and park that first opened in 2007, and this has an average of over 1,000 visitors per day. There are 55 tanks which are home to over 700 different species from the Mediterranean Sea and also from the Indian, Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Palma Aquarium has a series of research and investigation programs, including those for developing coral reefs, looking at reproduction and rehabilitation programs within artificially controlled environments. And it also runs a conservation campaign for the Mediterranean bluefin tuna, which is a species which is in danger of extinction due to overfishing. And it also carries out recovery programs for marine animal populations in regression or in danger of extinction. And it's a very, very popular visit for families who are on holiday on the island. Highly recommended. Now, I've spoken for about 40 minutes about the island of Mallorca, and I'm really, not just because I live here, but it's really an incredibly beautiful island. It's a wonderful place to live, and it's a wonderful place to visit. And what I've done here, I've prepared a Kahoot. So if you are interested in checking your knowledge about the island or that of your students, you can go to www.kahoot.it, and if you enter that PIN number, which is 064882, you have the opportunity to try this Kahoot, which I've written about the island. And this will be available for about a month. Now, if you don't have a chance, you don't have a pen with you, this talk that I've given will be online within about 24 hours. So you have a chance to access this number if you want to replay this video of the talk I've just given today. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any questions, I can be found on Twitter at Mallorca Jog, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Tomorrow I'll be giving a talk, and part of a Teach Meet organised by Discover the World Education, and I'll be talking about urban geography fieldwork. So thank you very much for listening, and I very much hope to welcome you to Mallorca at some point in the near future. Thank you very much.